This week's topic is heterosexism. When we talk about heterosexism, we can also call this concept cultural homophobia. Heterosexism is based on societal values that dictate that everyone is or should be heterosexual. So, intentionally or unintentionally, our society privileges heterosexuality and heterosexual persons and devalues, mistreats, or discriminates against lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirited, queer, and transgendered persons and those perceived to be so. When we talk about gender identity and sexual orientation, we're really talking about two different concepts, and it's important to understand the differences between these two terms. First, gender identity refers to a person's self-concept of one's gender that may be the same or may be different from one's sex at birth, for example, male, female, or intersex. When we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about one's sexual, affectional, and romantic interests to members of the same gender. That would be homosexual, or other gender, heterosexual, or both or all genders, bisexual. I've chosen three of the most common symbols that have been embraced by the LGBT community, and I wanted to make sure that you're familiar with these symbols so that if you see them, you know kind of where they came from. The first one is the lambda. It's used by both gays and lesbians today, and it was initially embraced in the 70s. It was officially adopted by the Gay Activist Association in New York City, which sponsored a number of public events for the gay community, beginning, I would say, in 1970. And at that point, the lambda sign soon became a quick way for members of the gay community to identify each other, with the reasoning that the lambda would easily be mistaken for a college fraternity symbol and ignored by the majority of the population. Back in December of 1974, the lambda was officially declared the international symbol for gay and lesbian rights by the International Gay Rights Congress in Edinburgh, Scotland. The rainbow is probably the most common symbol for the GLBT community today, and it was also developed in the 1970s in San Francisco. And each of the colors of the rainbow represent a different idea. Red for life, orange for healing, yellow for the sun, green for harmony with nature, blue for art, and purple for spirit. Finally, the triangle, the pink triangle specifically, this originated during World War II. It was created by the Nazis to identify gay and lesbian community members. And then, like the word queer, it has become a symbol of hate, which has been reclaimed and now stands for pride. I pulled this quote because I thought it it spoke to me when we talk about the issue of heterosexism and standing up for social justice and kind of fighting injustice. It's by a pastor named Martin Niemöller, who was imprisoned by the Nazis. And he used this quote in his post-World War II speeches to urge solidarity against all forms of repression. The U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. features the quote and sells this poster. If you haven't been to that museum, it's incredible. So I encourage you the next time you're in Washington, D.C. to go to the Holocaust Museum. Anyway, as I said before, various colored triangles were used by the Nazis to identify what they called dangerous persons. And this is all explained beneath the brick wall in the poster, which you can't see. It says, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. When we talk about different types of homophobia, just like when we talk about different kinds of discrimination, we can differentiate them by type. And so the first type that we can talk about is personal homophobia. This is prejudice based on personal beliefs that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are sinful, immoral, sick, inferior to heterosexuals, or incomplete in some way. Interpersonal homophobia is individual behavior based on personal homophobia. This hatred or dislike may be expressed by name-calling, telling jokes, verbal and physical harassment, and other individual acts of discrimination. When we talk about institutional homophobia, we're talking about the many ways in which government, businesses, churches, and other institutions and organizations discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation. And finally, when we talk about cultural homophobia, we're talking about societal standards and norms which dictate that being heterosexual is better or more moral than being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and that everyone is or should be heterosexual. And so when we talked about cultural homophobia in the very first slide, I said that that was kind of a euphemism for heterosexism. You can kind of think of those two concepts as the same. Correlates of homophobia, then. When we talk about demographic correlates of homophobia, we're talking about basically in contrast to heterosexuals who have with favorable attitudes towards gay people, those with negative attitudes are more likely to be men, older, less well educated, and reside in geographic areas where negative attitudes represent the norm. For example, rural areas or the Midwest or southern United States, i.e. Texas. When we think about political and religious values, we're thinking about, again, these are correlates of homophobia. These are people most likely to be homophobic or heterosexist. Those are people who are more likely to attend religious services frequently, more likely to endorse orthodox religious beliefs such as the literal truth of the Bible, more likely to be Republican than a Democrat or independent, and more likely to describe themselves as politically conservative rather than liberal or moderate. When we talk about personality and attitudinal characteristics, we're talking about people who display higher levels of psychological authoritarianism. Hopefully you remember early in this semester we talked about authoritarianism as a type of personality trait developed by Theodore Adorno. If you don't remember, I encourage you to go back to that slide. That PowerPoint slideshow that talked about prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. We also know that people are more likely to be homophobic if they are less sexually permissive and are more supportive of traditional gender roles. So when we talk about examples of homophobia, we can think of these kind of on a variety of levels. Gay bashing, of course, or physical violence, which might include sexual violence, making derogatory comments, innuendos, insults, slurs, jokes, or threats about sexual orientation or sexual practice, silencing talk of sexual or gender diversity, forcing people to come out or to stay in the closet, so meaning disclose or hide their sexual orientation, linking homosexuality with pedophilia or child abuse, rejecting friends or family members because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, behaving as though sexual orientation is solely about sexual practice, believing that sexual orientation is a lifestyle choice, or treating the sexual orientations or gender identities of LGBTQTT persons as less than valid than those of heterosexuals. So when we talk about heterosexual privilege, then, we're talking about things like being able to show affection in public safely and comfortably without fear of harassment or violence, openly being able to talk about one's partner and relationships to others without considering the consequences, benefiting from societal normalcy, or the assumption that heterosexual individuals and relationships are valid, healthy, and non-deviant, assuming that all people in relationships are heterosexual unless otherwise known, and not facing rejection from one's family and friends because of one's sexual orientation or gender identity. being able to easily access positive role models and media images for one's gender identity and sexual orientation, not being asked to speak on behalf of all heterosexuals, using gender-specific pronouns when referring to one's spouse or partner without discomfort or fear of reprisal, having automatic recognition of one's spouse as next of kin in emergencies, easily select reading or viewing materials in which heterosexuality is the predominantly reflected orientation, have families similar to one's own represented in children's literature, raise children without fear that they will be rejected or harassed by peers because of their parents' sexual orientation or gender identities, receive support and validation from a religious community, not risk being denied employment, housing, or other services because of one's sexual orientation or gender identity, not be seen as needing therapy to cure one's sexual orientation or gender expression, and the ability to marry. So in order to be anti-heterosexist, which is what we want to be in this class, we want to use gender-inclusive and non-heterosexist language. So don't assume that you know someone's sexual orientation or gender of one's romantic interests. Use inclusive language even if you know someone is heterosexual. And finally, help educate and encourage others to use inclusive language as well. Assume that anyone could be lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, two-spirited, transgendered, or heterosexual. Don't assume that everyone is heterosexual unless you know otherwise, or that everyone should be heterosexual. Similarly, don't assume that someone is lesbian or gay based on stereotypes or assumptions about one's friends. Don't ever out people. Don't force people to disclose their sexual orientation. If you know that someone is lesbian or gay or is questioning one's sexual orientation, don't assume that you can tell anyone else. Be sensitive to the fact that some people are out in some areas of their lives but not in others. Don't think of lesbian and gay people solely in terms of their sexual orientation. Just as the lives of heterosexual people include far more than their attraction to members of the opposite sex, members of the LGBTQ community also have friends, interests, and multifaceted interests related to their sexual orientation. Don't define anyone by sexual orientation. Remember that an individual's sexual orientation involves more than sexual behavior. It includes attraction, companionship, intimacy, and emotional attachments, as well as sexual activity. Do not force people to hide their sexual orientation or gender identity. Don't assume that LGBTQ people are suffering or have regrets about their sexual orientation and want to be heterosexual. Likewise, if someone who is lesbian or gay is having problems, don't assume that sexual orientation is the cause. Finally, recognize the intersections and similarities of prejudice. Heterosexism and other forms of oppression and discrimination have similarities and many areas of overlap. For more on heterosexism and homophobia, I have two links. One is an Understanding Prejudice link. It has a ton of different resources, videos, materials that are available to peruse. It has lots of links to different websites that can be helpful. And also, this bottom one, Media That Matters, is a link to a film festival that has short films on a variety of different topics, and they're all free. And I encourage you to peruse this. Some of them are as short as 1 or 2 minutes long, and they're really excellent films. So I hope you'll take the advantage to kind of take your learning to the next level and learn from some of these additional materials that are presented here on the slides. Thanks.